where, the why, and everything all planned out. And this is a good reminder for me, and I hope that it's a good reminder for you as well. Today is Palm Sunday, and I think it might be the best day for us to address this defining moment, because what we see is on Palm Sunday, we have the people of Israel declaring that Jesus as their king, and Jesus accepts that title. So what we have going on, just a little bit of history, just a little biblical history, is Jesus had been to Jerusalem before. But what we see in Jesus' ministry is a very specific pattern that early in his ministry, Jesus stayed to mainly rural areas in the Galilee area around in Nazareth and where he is from, in the Sea of Galilee, where many of his disciples are from. He stayed in that rural area, and he would go into an area and he would do ministry until the crowds began to grow, and then he would leave and he would go to another area, and he would minister there until the crowds got too large. It was as if Jesus was saying by his actions, I'm not ready to go full on public yet. I want to begin laying out the foundation of who I am and the teachings that I've come to bring. But once it would hit a tipping point, Jesus would move on. We see that with the feeding of the 5,000. There were probably 15, 16, 17, maybe as many as 20,000 total. But they only counted the men that were there. But this large crowd had gathered, and Jesus is trying to get away from the crowd. He's trying to move on, and the crowd pursues him in that story after he feeds them. And it's maybe one of the most difficult chapters in the gospel is when Jesus is then confronted by the people who are kind of chasing after him. And they're really chasing after him because they want more free lunches. And Jesus deals with that. And this is a chapter where Jesus says, it's not about your physical food, it's about your spiritual food. And the crowd does not understand it. And it says many people abandoned him, and it said even many disciples. And this is where we have the famous moment where Jesus looks at his own, the 12, and he says, are you going to leave too? Are you going to go with the rest of the crowd as they abandon me? And it's Peter who speaks up, and he says, who else should we go to? Who else has the words of eternal life that we can go to? And so we see this pattern. And Jesus, for the festivals and for the holy days, Jesus would go into Jerusalem, and he would celebrate Passover, but then he would leave, and most of his ministry did not take place in Jerusalem. But over Jesus' 3 years of ministry, towards the end, the crowds began to grow larger and larger and larger, and there was a significant event that caused things to just go over the tipping point, and that was the resurrecting of Lazarus. When Lazarus, who had been dead for 4 days in the tomb, and Jesus called him out of the tomb, even the Pharisees, the religious leaders said, this man needs to die. It's out of control now. We can no longer control what's happening here. He needs to die. And he says it is good for the one to die for the many. A very prophetic statement that they make because they're afraid of the riots that are going to take place and the way that the people are going to rise up. And that's really the culmination of what Palm Sunday is. Jesus comes into Jerusalem, as was his habit, to celebrate Passover. And as he comes, the word had gotten out, and there were so many people that were supporting him and behind him who believed he was the Messiah, that Palm Sunday happens. And we have this elaborate celebration that takes place of him riding in on a donkey and them laying their coats on the palms on the ground and then putting the coats on the donkey for him to sit on. This whole thing. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. All of this is them welcoming Jesus into Jerusalem as their king. And Jesus accepts that title because he is the King of Kings. It was prophetic. But what the people wanted, they wanted to control Jesus, and they wanted to tell him what they thought the Messiah should do and what the Messiah should be about. And what they wanted was they wanted him to save them from the Romans. That's the number one deal that the Messiah had come for, to rise up as a great king and a leader, to throw off the oppression of the Romans, establish Israel as a great nation, and bring in an era of just perfection and glory and power and wealth and prosperity for everyone. That's what they wanted. That's what they thought the Messiah was supposed to do. But that's not what Jesus came to do. Jesus came to deal with our sin on the cross, not overthrow the Romans. And so, because Jesus wouldn't act, because they assumed that the movement was going to take legs, and that it was going to start rolling, and the people were going to rise up, and they were going to throw the Romans out of Jerusalem, and it was going to expand from there, and no one could stand against the might of the Messiah. And there were people who were ready to fight. And that is the zealots that you read about, and Judas was one of them that thought that, here we go, it's going to happen. But it didn't happen. Jesus refused to attack the Romans. Instead, so much of his language was about love your enemies, serve them, help them. If a Roman soldier asks you to carry their pack for a mile, go 2 miles. And the people rejected Jesus that same week. Why? Because they couldn't control him and make him into what they wanted him to be. And so next week we celebrate. Friday, Jesus is crucified. And Sunday we celebrate the resurrection. Today, we're going to see an interaction between Jesus and Pilate that takes place between these days, Thursday, Friday, before Jesus is crucified, where Pilate thinks he's in control. And he wants to use Jesus to remain in control. And what Pilate learns is he isn't in control at all, and that Jesus really was. So let's get into it this morning. John chapter 18, starting in verse 33, it says, Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" This is the accusation that's been made against him. He claims to be a king. He's stirring up a revolution against the Romans, and this is not a huge leap. Pilate is not an idiot. Do you really think he doesn't know what happened on Palm Sunday? Do you really think he doesn't have news that the people welcomed him into Jerusalem as their king and Messiah? And that Pilate hadn't dealt with other messiahs before? People who would try to rise up against the might of Rome, that he had to squash? Pilate was fully aware of what was going on with Jesus. He would be an idiot not to. And so Pilate knew, and so he knew the accusation. He knew what happened on Palm Sunday, and so he goes right to the crux of the matter. Are you the king of the Jews? Is that your own idea, Jesus asked, or did others talk to you about me? In other words, Jesus was saying, did the religious leaders feed you a bunch of information? Or did others tell you what they have heard and seen about me? Pilate, who do you think I am? Who do you think I am? And that is the question for all of us to deal with. Is that your own idea? Have you dealt with who you think I am? Or are you just going with others say about me? And Pilate replies, am I a Jew? He's like, I have no interest in your religion. I have no interest in your whole deal of your nation and Messiah stuff. I don't care about that stuff. It was your people and your chief priests who handed you over to me. Because this is a Jewish issue. I'm not Jewish. They handed you over to me. Don't be pressing me for where I stand on you. I don't really care. What is it that you have done? There's a lot of wisdom in that question that we see and understand the political savvy of Pilate. What Pilate is saying is, Jesus, you can tell me what's really going on here. What's really going on? Because he has his feelers out. He has his people that are watching and monitoring everything, that are reporting to him. And he knows what Jesus is teaching and saying. And that he understands this is a peaceful thing. Jesus isn't looking to rise. He's had many opportunities to do so. He had a legion, 5,000 men that he fed a lunch to. Pilate would have been aware of that. That's a legion, 5,000 men that he could have militarized and brought against. Instead, he scattered them. See, Pilate knows what's going on, and he knows the kind of person that Jesus is, and he's like, this doesn't make sense. Why are they selling you out? What is it that you've done? I want to know, why are the chief priests so ticked off at you? Because what I see in you is not so bad. So what have you done? Why the big rush to get you crucified and done away with before Passover? What have you done to irritate my enemies? And that's truly, Pilate had this love, hate relationship with the religious leaders because it was Pilate's job to keep peace in Israel. And he knew the only way he could have peace in Israel is to keep the chief priests happy. And so the chief priests are always making demands on Pilate for what they require to keep the peace, because he knows if the chief priests start to speak to the people and say they're irritated with the Romans, that's going to tick them off and that's going to start more problems. So Pilate is constantly working to keep them pacified and to keep them happy so they keep paying their taxes, because Pilate has great aspirations. The role that Pilate is playing in Israel is it's like the armpit of the Roman Empire. It's like one of the worst places to be sent, because in almost every other nation that the Romans conquered, when the Romans would conquer them, this is the kind of mental position they would take. Well, you guys actually do a lot of things better than our old government did and our old leaders did. And, you guys got indoor plumbing. We never had that before. And that's pretty cool. And you build nice roads and you bring economy and commerce. And most of them said, hey, we love Hellenism. We love the Greek philosophy and the Greek dress and the language. And they would willingly embrace all of it. The language, the dress, the Romans' gods and goddesses, they would go all in for all of it. But there was one nasty place in all of the Roman Empire that would not just turn away from their own God and their own traditions, and it was Israel. And Pilate knew, if I can keep things solid and stable in Israel for a long enough time, Caesar is going to notice me. The emperor is going to notice me. And I'm going to move up the chain. And I'm going to move way up. He had great aspirations. And so he was passionate about keeping things functioning. So he said, what have you done to irritate my enemies? I hate those guys. So there's a part of him that's like, I kind of like you, Jesus, because you irritated the guys who irritate me. And that's not such a bad thing. Jesus says in verse 36, my kingdom is not of this world. Jesus makes this statement to Pilate that changes everything. He says, if it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews, but now my kingdom is from another place. To which Pilate felt relief. Jesus has no intention to try to fight the Romans. He's from another kingdom in another world. Woo! His kingdom's in another world. Woo! It's the Marvel and, kind of multiverse kind of a thing. Which multiverse are you a king of? He's like, woo. This was some crazy religious fight between the Jews, and Jesus essentially is looking at Pilate saying, I don't want your title. I don't want your job. I'm not trying to knock you guys out of here. I'm about another kingdom from another place. 37, 38. He says, you are a king then, said Pilate. Jesus answered, you are right in saying I am a king. In fact, it is for this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. And then Pilate is a whole other sermon we can get into. Pilate responds, what is truth? What is truth? Because Pilate, as a politician, says truth doesn't matter. Does that ring a bell? Does that correlate to anything you've seen or heard in the news? Anything? Pilate's like, truth? I create truth. I make truth. I pay people to go around and spread new truth and create truth. Truth doesn't matter to me. What is truth? I don't. There is no objective truth. There is no right or wrong. And Jesus says, I'm here to define that. And Pilate is like, none of that matters. I don't live for truth, because Pilate lives for something else. You see, who cares about truth? Truth is irrelevant. Here's what Pilate lives for. What's relevant is power, and what's relevant is authority. You see, when I speak, it happens. And if I tell everybody and I point up in the sky at the sun and I say, that's the moon, everybody goes, yes, sir, it's the moon. He had that kind of power. He's like, I don't care about truth. So I can rewrite everything. My reality is all that matters. With this, he went out again to the Jews. Pilate goes out. And he said, I find no basis for a charge against him. I think part of Pilate is like, I like Jesus. He ticks these guys off so bad. They are so angry and upset with him. And I love it. They keep them busy. They don't come and bother me. And he's like, really? There's no evidence of a military coup or an uprising. There's nothing going on here. He has no interest in attacking us. What are you talking about, King of the Jews? There's no basis. And so Pilate is like, there's no threat to Rome. There's no problem. Let's move on. Let's move forward. And Pilate is under the assumption that he has the authority and the power to control this whole situation. And he's done it 1,000,000 times. And that's what he's going to do here. He's going to get his way, and he's going to get done what he wants done because he's in control. He says, but it's your custom for me to release one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the King of the Jews? He's laying it on. He's like, come on. I know you guys announced him as King of the Jews. I know you guys were singing the songs, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord on Palm Sunday. I know you guys laid palms down on the ground as he came in on a donkey. I know who you think he is. You want me to kill this man? Here, I'll release him to you. He's your king. I want to give him back to you. Because during Passover, Pilate would show this kindness by observing this Jewish custom to release a prisoner at this time. But Pilate is only leveraging that to set Jesus free because he wants to stay in control. It's his way of controlling the situation. He had surely heard about how Jesus received into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, so he knew that the people had loved him. He knew they were singing songs to him just a few days ago. Obviously, this is a win-win. This is a win-win, right? No, not so much. Verse 40. And the Jewish people that were gathered there, shouted back, no, not him. Give us Barabbas. Now, let me just pause. I don't have a lot of time this morning, but let me just tell you about Barabbas. And this is what shocked Pilate. Barabbas led a rebellion against the Romans that had gotten hundreds, if not 1,000 or more, Jewish people killed. His uprising was so bad, and that so many Jewish young men died, that the Jewish people actually ratted him out and gave him up to the Romans because he was getting so many people killed. They actually turned on Barabbas and got him arrested and thrown in jail. But here's what's happening in the psyche of the people. We declared Jesus as Messiah, and he's done nothing. We haven't been able to control him to do what we wanted him to do. And so we're going to trade in Jesus, and we're going to get Barabbas because we can control him. He'll do what we want him to do, which is go attack the Romans. It's exactly what's going on. It says Barabbas had taken part in a rebellion. And suddenly, this man Pilate, who's in power, the man who's in control, he seems to be losing both. And so Pilate makes a drastic decision. He makes a decision that no good leader would make. And as a matter of fact, we see this throughout history. We see this in leadership. When leaders get backed into a corner, when their authority and power is questioned, when they start to lose control, they make some horrific decisions and they do some outlandish things to try to retain control and power. And that's exactly what Pilate does. It says, then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. One word, flogged, is all that it says. But in that word, There is so much. If you have seen the movie The Passion of Christ, you have some idea of what that word flogged means. And you can look it up. I'm not going to go into detail. I was going to show you some pictures of the implements that they would use to flog a person. It's horrible. It's horrific. These leather bands that were on a stick with glass and pieces of metal and metal balls on it, that you wouldn't just strike a person in the back. No. These things were made so that when they would hit you, it would wrap all the way around your waist. It would strike you in the back, and it would go all the way around your waist, and it would snap around, and then they would pull, and it would rip the skin right off of your body. The beating was so bad that it was illegal to do this, to flog a Roman citizen. As a matter of fact, we see that in the book of Acts with Paul. Paul is flogged, he is beaten, but he was a Roman citizen, and he tells them afterwards, you beat me, you flogged me, and I'm a Roman citizen, and they get very scared, because they know they weren't allowed to do that. And you can read that in the book of Acts. 39 lashes were given because 40 lashes would kill most men. This is the severity of the beating. This is how bad. And so Pilate chooses to do this to stay in control of the situation. Surely the people would back off after they see Jesus, after he is beaten so badly. The scriptures say that he doesn't even look human anymore. That most men either die or their lives forever are changed. They are never the same again. I read a report of a cardiologist who studied all of these events from Jesus' flogging to his crucifixion. And he said from the evidence, he said it seems that during this flogging that the beating was so severe and went so deep that it tore his pericardium around his heart while they were flogging him. And it's the reason why he didn't have the strength to carry his own crossbeam to the cross, that he was beaten so badly, and why he died, because on average, most people would last 2 or 3 days before they would die through crucifixion, and Jesus died in just a couple of hours. That his blood pressure dropped so deathly, and that blood was pooling up in his chest from ripping the sac around his heart, and he was slowly dying from this beating. And Pilate said, surely after they see him, after the crowd sees him, after what my centurions are going to do to him, they'll back off. Verses 2 to 4 in John 19. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! And they struck him in the face. Once more, Pilate came out and said to the Jews, Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him. In the other Gospels, it says things like they blindfolded him and would take turns. They would dance around him and just punch him and hit him. In the other Gospels, it says they literally physically ripped his beard out of his face, just pulled his beard out of his face. As they mocked him and ridiculed him. This was what they did. And Pilate set them loose on this man. And then this bleeding, half-dead man is brought out before the crowd so that Pilate could say, okay, I'm telling you this man has done nothing. I want you to think about this just for a second. Pilate is saying he's broken no rules, he's broken no laws, he is innocent, he hasn't done anything wrong, but because of you, I've done this to him. Surely you're done with this man. He will never be the same. This man will never walk the same again. This man's life is destroyed because of what we just did to him. Surely your wrath is satisfied, right? Pilate knows that he's punished an innocent man, but to keep control, that is what he's willing to do. And Pilate is desperately trying to keep control while control is slipping right out of his hands. So when Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, Here is the man! As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, Crucify! Crucify! But Pilate answered, You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him. The Jews insisted, we have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God. And when Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. Why was Pilate afraid? This man who had worked his whole life to have a position of power, authority, and control, suddenly, slowly, it is all slipping away, and he doesn't know what to do. And he is now at the point where he's like, news is going to get back to Rome. The emperor is going to hear about this. Surely these religious leaders are going to write letters, and men who are here under my control, who are also have their own aspirations, that they want my job and my position, are going to tell their friends in Rome. And word is going to get out that this is getting out of control, and I'm going to lose my opportunity to get out of here and move on to greater things. And so Pilate does another strange thing. He goes back inside the palace, away from the crowds, and he has Jesus brought before him again to question him. And again, this is when we oftentimes, because we so often read the Bible in such tiny little pieces and just a few verses at a time, we don't get the big picture. And I just want you to imagine this for a moment. Think about what's going on. Here's Pilate in his beautiful palace with all of his attendants and his soldiers around, and standing before him is Jesus, who's been beaten so badly he isn't even recognizable any longer. He is literally almost bleeding to death in front of him. Blood is dripping off of him. He has open wounds. He has this crown. He is the hair on his beard has been ripped out of his face. His face is swollen. He can barely see. His blood pressure is dropped. He is barely able to stand. And standing in his palace, there is Jesus. And there sits Pilate. This unbelievable picture. Unbelievable picture of what Pilate does to bring him back into his palace. Just a dripping, bloody mess. Almost dead. And he went back inside the palace, and he questions this guy. He begins to ask Jesus questions. Where do you come from? Jesus had said, I come from another kingdom. My kingdom's of another. So Pilate wants to know more. Where do you come from? He asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. Now, there could be a lot of reasons for it. One may be Jesus didn't want to answer, but the other reason may be Jesus is barely alive and doesn't even have the strength to respond. Matthew tells us that when Jesus refused to answer, that Pilate was amazed that Jesus wasn't there, because Pilate was used to controlling this whole scenario. Pilate could make men admit to crimes they never committed by doing this kind of stuff. He was able to control, through his power and authority, every situation and every scenario. And here stands what's left of Jesus. And he's not playing games. He's not playing Pilate's game. Pilate knew how men responded under these circumstances, and Jesus wasn't playing the game. Do you refuse to speak to me? Pilate said. Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you? You see, Pilate's saying, I'm in control. Your destiny is in my hands. I decide whether you live or die. I decide how you die. I decide when you die. How dare you stand there and ignore me and not respond? Pilate is about to have his defining moment. And Jesus answers. He says, you would have, look at this. Jesus goes again to the heart of the issue. Pilate, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. in the midst of this horror of what is happening, Jesus says to Pilate, Pilate, you're not in charge. Pilate, my destiny is not in your hands. Pilate, you control nothing other than what has been granted to you to control, and only for a limited moment. Pilate, my hands may be bound, but my hands are not bound. Your hands may be free, but your hands are not free, because you are not in control. Pilate, you think you're in control, but you have no control here. The only control you have is the control that's been given to you from above. And if you would let that single solitary truth sink in and penetrate your heart, it would change the way you see and respond to everything in life. Because the reality is, there's a little bit of Pilate in all of us. We all want to be in control. And Jesus speaks, and he says your name, and he says my name. And this is what he says. You would have no authority unless it had been given to you from above. You are not in control. You may think you're in control. You may feel like you're in control. You may spend most of your life trying to keep all the plates spinning and keep everything going, and you think you're making it happen. But what Jesus would say to you and what he would say to me today is, it's an illusion. The only control you have is the control that God above has given you, and that's only for a short period of time. And Pilate got it. It got through, because look at what it says in the verse. It says, from then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free. It's like, man, there was something in Jesus that Pilate decided was worth trying to keep alive. It says, from then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free. But the Jews kept shouting, if you let this man go, you are, here it is. We're going to hit you in your weakest spot, Pilate. You are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. They are, hint, hint, nudge, nudge. This is going to be the content of the letter we send to Rome. Just letting you know right now. There was a man who claimed to be king, and that is a threat to Caesar, and you supported him. You helped him. You would not do what needed to be done. And that's the story that Caesar is going to hear. That's what we're going to tell him. And now, Pilate is caught between two kings. The king in Rome and the bloody and beaten king before him. The question is, which king does he submit to? And that's our question. Which king do you choose when you're clinging to power? When everything in you is saying, stay in control. Let's look at the end of the story. It says, when Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out, and he sat down on the judges, the bema seat, and at the place known as the stone pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of Passover week, about the 6th hour. Here is your king, Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, take him away, crucify him. Only the Romans could crucify him. They didn't want Jesus back. Pilate is going, here, take him. He's free. Let him go. And they're going, no, you guys need to crucify him. He says, shall I crucify your king? Pilate asked. And here we go. They're playing the game. They're pushing all the right buttons. They're pulling all the right levers. We have no king but Caesar. Pfft. Can you even believe they say, we have no king but Caesar? This is such a political game. Truth is out the window at this point. We have no king but Caesar, the chief priest answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. When we live our lives from the standpoint of, I must be in control of all things and all people and all events around me, when we live with the perspective of, if I don't, it won't, and if I don't, he won't, and if I don't, she won't, when somehow we confuse ourselves with the one who is actually in control, that perspective on life opens you up to unbearable anxiety and fear. It puts you under the weight of, I've got to keep it all working, and I've got to keep it all going. But you see, there is an incredible freedom when you come to the conclusion that God has entrusted a limited amount of authority to you for a short period of time. Your responsibility and my responsibility is to just be a good steward of the limited authority that God has given us. We have very little authority. We have very little control. We have very little power. We have tiny little bits that God gives us for short a period of time. And all we can do is try to be good stewards of those moments and make good choices in them. But listen to me. All you control freaks out there, listen, catch this. You are not responsible for controlling outcomes. You are not responsible for controlling the way people react, the way that people behave, and the way that life goes, because control is the opposite of love. And when your main activity and emotional connection to your family is control, then your family doesn't feel loved. And you're trying to force outcomes on people. You're trying to make them behave in a way that you want them to behave. But you have to understand something. Your power, your authority, and your control is very limited. And you cannot force the outcome. Because you can lead a horse to water, but well, there's 3 people awake at this point. I'm so glad for that. Wow. Because you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. But some of you are stressed out, and you're stressing your families out, trying to get them to behave, and getting them to react, and getting them to do life the way you want them to do it. And you can't. You can't control the outcomes. Today we celebrate Palm Sunday, the day that the people chose Jesus to be their king. Why? So that they could be in control and have the power, that they could manipulate Jesus to do what they wanted him to do. And I want to give you the opportunity today to put your faith and trust in the one who is in control of tomorrow and next week and next year. Because here's the reality. All of us control freaks. Ready? As much as we can prepare and as much as we can make our plans and we can ration it all out and we can collect all the data and we can store up all of our stuff and we can make sure we've got all the bases covered, here's the reality. Ready? You don't know what's going to happen in the next minute, in the next hour, in the next day, let alone the next year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. You are not in control, but there is one who is in control of the next minute and the next hour and the next week and the next year and the next 10 years. Put your faith and trust in the one who is in control. And you could stop working so hard to control everything because God is God and you are not. Put your trust in him today that he can save you and keep you, and let the outcomes in God's hands. Will you stand with me as we close today? Father, I thank you, Lord, for your word today. God, this message is for me as much as it is for anybody else in this room today. As much as we have this desire to control everyone and everything, when we live our lives that way, people don't feel loved. They feel manipulated. So God, help us to learn to love our families first and to trust you with our tomorrows. That, Lord, the small authority that you've given us, that we would walk in it and be good stewards of it, but that we can realize we can't control the outcomes. All we can do is be faithful. And so, God, we put our faith in you and our trust in you for tomorrow and next week and next month and next year. That doesn't allow us to just shut it all down and stop trying and stop worrying and stop balancing our checkbooks because everything is just going to be okay. No, no, no.